Welcome to MiWeek, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. If you could get past all of that snow and cold, it was a pretty busy start to the first full week of the new year. Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has spent his first week in office, and he made a pretty big promise. We'll talk about that coming up. Plus, Detroit City Council changes leadership, and one member has a few choice words for a Detroit News editorial. Also coming up, a quick look on what to expect from the North American International Auto Show as journalists from around the world head to town this weekend. And we'll also cover Governor Snyder's Super Bowl ad buy and how that really sets up this election year. But first tonight, we're in the money. Okay, sort of. The state has a surplus, an estimated almost $1.3 billion over the next 3 years. So naturally, the argument in Lansing is over what to do with it. Should it go to roads, schools, perhaps a break on personal income tax? The governor may give us an idea of his plans next week during the State of the State address. So let's start right there with our MiWeek contributors. Nolan Finley, the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, I love how you then all of a sudden sit up there. You're ready to go.
We were slouching before.
You were slouching before. All right, so it is a brand new year. We've got a lot of stuff on the docket, and I guess it's good news that we have some extra money to play around with. But of course, the argument always starts, and we are in an election year, how to spend that money wisely.
Well, and that's always, I think sometimes a surplus is a more dangerous thing than a deficit, because everybody's got ideas for how to spend the same pool of money 100 different ways. I think anyone who's driven on Michigan roads over the last few days knows that money, every dime of it, should go to infrastructure. We are woefully behind in maintaining our roads and bridges, and it's going to put us at a competitive disadvantage, and it's beating the heck out of our cars. The mirror fell off my truck the other day.
Well, that's very sad for your truck. But you know what? But if that didn't fly last year, and that was a huge part of the governor's State of the State last year, then how is it going to fly this year?
Well, I mean, they used part of last year's surplus for roads. What they haven't done, and I don't anticipate they'll do it again this year, is find a permanent funding source. So why not take this surplus and at least get through the election year when you can have maybe a more rational discussion about funding roads?
All right, so where should that surplus go? Should it go to roads?
Roads is a good idea. Early ed, I think, is another good idea. We're 60 million short still on the ask for that on an annual basis. I think the idea, though, is that it's got to be investment rather than just spending, right? You don't take a surplus and act like it's a splurge windfall kind of thing. You want to, and you also don't want to build in permanent cost to the budget with it. It's a surplus. It may not be there next year. It may not be there in 5 years. And so some of the ideas, for example, giving a tax cut, which essentially changes your ledger.
Well, why not give a tax cut? I mean, it would make people very happy. You know, it would seem that would be a thing to do.
Let's cut taxes every year for that matter. I mean, the point is, we just we just got the budget balanced 2 or 3 years ago. You don't want to add costs, permanent costs, into a budget based on a surplus. A great analogy for this is in fact the problem with the Detroit pension funds in some way. One of the big problems they had was that they would have a surplus in a lot of years where they would make more money than they thought they would, or they'd have more cash on hand than they thought they would, and what they would do with it is they would plow it back into people's checks. They would give a 13th check to pension recipients, or they'd set up these annuities. That's one of the reasons that the cost structure for the pensions doesn't work now. You can't do that. A surplus is a misleading term. I mean, it's an overage in revenue that can be a one-time thing, and if you build in permanent costs for it, you end up like the Detroit pension fund.
And the state just committed to a huge expansion of Medicaid due to Obamacare, and nobody knows how long the federal government is going to pick up the cost for that. And when the federal government starts backing out, we're stuck with a huge entitlement here. I'm a big tax cut guy, but I think it's a little reckless to cut taxes at a time when you don't know what your future expenses are going to be.
And the election year is really going to make this an interesting conversation anyway.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Republican majority wants to give a tax cut because they
looks pretty good when you're running for office again to say, look, I just cut your taxes.
Wait a minute, a lot of Democrats are calling for tax
I'm sure they
cut,
will.
too. I mean, they'll argue over who gets the tax cut.
Right. This is what every representative wants to take home to their district in the fall and say, hey, look this is what I did for you, because it's one of the few things that your average voter can just relate to, right? You cut my taxes, so I like you.
I want to talk about the possibility of putting some more money with education. When we talk about education, it feels like, though, we break down into whether we're going to be talking about pre-K, K through 12, or higher ed.
Yeah.
And I think it starts to divide those camps a little bit. Will you start to see lobbying from those different areas of education when we say put it back into education?
Well, of course, and you know, they all feel like they've been shortchanged. K-12 education in the state budget has not been shortchanged. Their money has not been cut. They've lost some federal money. They haven't lost state money.
They got cut.
They did not. They got cut one time and it's been restored. The universities have been cut. I mean, they've had serious
They've had a lot deeper
cuts,
cuts.
$1 billion out of their state funding. You might think about putting some money there, although they remain the most inefficient institutions in the state. And you know, pre-K, there's
that's pretty
wow.
That's pretty harsh.
You know they do.
The most inefficient
government institutions in the state. The pre-K, though, I mean, we've identified that as something that could help make Michigan smarter, make us more competitive. And we're not funding it.
All right, last word on this.
Well, I mean, I think higher ed, too, we're behind. We lag other states in the way that we've invested in higher ed. It's not about whether they're efficient or inefficient. It's that we're just not investing the way we should. So I think they should be in line and, you know, behind pre-K, which I think, but that's also not a big ask. They only wanted $120 million a year for that at the higher ed, and you're talking about, you know, billions that we need to be shifting there to catch up to other states.
All right, before we leave talk about state politics, let's take a look at the fact that Governor Snyder has bought a Super Bowl ad time again, and he still hasn't officially said if he's going to run again, but this would be the large signal that he's going to kick it off.
I'm not running.
Hey, I'm not running, right. I mean, that's it, but it really kicks off, and we're hearing this news again with the word that Mark Schauer is going to be using some public funds for the primary. What is that? How does that set up our race, Nolan?
Well, clearly, Mark Schauer is going to be outspent probably 10-1 unless the Democrats feel that's a competitive race and they start drawing in a lot of outside money. I don't expect that's going to happen. The governor is not going to take public funding. He will be well funded and he will have a pretty big war chest. And I think the fact that he's spending, is it $400,000 on these Super Bowl ads, suggests what sort of resources he's going to have in this race.
I think Schauer's camp would also continually say, though, that the governor still doesn't have the approval rating of over 50%. Stephen, what would you say the governor has to project to the state of Michigan to get reelected?
Well, I mean, I actually think he's in great shape to get reelected because of the competition he has. I mean, this is a governor with a very low approval rating. What is it, 36% now? I mean, that in any other context, that would be seen as a vulnerable incumbent. But Mark Schauer doesn't have the name recognition, does not have the money, as Nolan pointed out, or at least has not yet attracted the money.
Doesn't have ideas.
He's not laid out. I mean, you know, look, I think he's got a lot of work to do putting together what he would do as governor of Michigan. He's done a good job of saying what he, you know, doesn't like about what the governor's doing, but you gotta have a platform. It's mystifying to me, quite frankly, how they're managing this, because this is a vulnerable incumbent who could be knocked off with a strong candidate. They're not even. It's almost like they're not even trying to make Schauer into that.
So they're not setting it up well.
Well, and there's some Democrats out there. I've been hearing some rumblings about maybe we ought to try someone else. Maybe we ought to have a competitive primary.
Don't you think that's a little late in the game for that?
It's January.
I know, but
well, and who would you throw?
And that's the problem. They haven't been able to find somebody willing to do it.
Yeah.
But there is some concern that this guy is just not lighting a fire here.
All right, well, we'll see. We'll see what that Super Bowl ad holds. And, it is just the beginning of an election year, right?
Well, the great thing about this Super Bowl ad is the sort of bookend nature of it. I mean, this is how Rick Snyder introduced himself to people 4 years ago. Nobody knew who he was. And
no one knew really who he was.
And even after it, people were sort of chuckling a little, saying, well, is this guy really going to be governor? And, you know, he is.
Fast forward. All right.